Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. As we're working together through the book of Genesis, we've reached a really challenging and difficult passage. Genesis chapter 34 is the story of Dinah and the Shechemites. It's a story of evil, it's a story of sexual violence, and it's a story where we see how it is responded to. It's a very challenging scripture dealing with challenging subjects, but I do hope that we can learn something from it, something about how we should respond when we're living in a wicked world surrounded by evil. So join with me today on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. A quick reminder that if you're new to this, that all of these studies contain a transcript of approximately what I've said, and you'll find access to that in the episode notes page of any audio version of the podcast. Okay, today we're covering Genesis chapter 34, and this is the story, of course, of Dinah and the Shechemites, and I've given the overall title to what we're going to be looking at over the next couple of days, Responding to Wickedness. See what we can learn from this really difficult, really challenging story. Now, I don't have to tell you that we live today in a very wicked world. You would probably agree with that question, I'm sure, most of you. But what I want us to ask over the next 2 days is how should we respond to situations? Because at the end of the day, we're surrounded by evil and wickedness. So how do we live within those societies in that world? And how should we respond when events take a turn on the dark side? What is this proper response to the reality of what we have to face and what we see happen? And what is an improper response when evil rears its ugly head in front of us? We are all faced with it all the time, and we all have to, by nature, have to choose to respond to it one way or another, even, in fact, if we do nothing. Now, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Is it okay to do nothing as a response to evil around us? The other option is to go to the extreme and live a life in fear all the time, or respond in a way that's inappropriate. So can we find a middle ground? Is there a correct way to live in a wicked world? What is the wise way? What is the godly way to respond to the wicked world in which we live? The search is to try and find a way to live alongside and respond to evil, and to try and figure out a way that honors the Lord and yet seeks what is right for all occasions and for all parties all of the time. It's a difficult path to navigate, friends. But I believe that the story contained within Genesis chapter 4 can offer us a few insights. Now, in going through the whole book of Genesis as we've been doing, we've come to a passage which I think can give us some help, at least a few insights into how we might respond. Now, it's a really troubling chapter, and those of us who approach it in isolation, anyone who approaches this chapter in isolation without remembering that the events depicted within it lie within the context of not only the entire story of Jacob, but within the context of the entire book of Genesis. And if you've just arrived today in isolation, or you're someone who's studying chapter 4 in isolation, you are in great danger of reaching wrong conclusions by just looking at the text in isolation. So we're going to approach it cautiously, friends, and we'll do as we always do, which is initially we'll work through it, the chapter verse by verse. And the opening verse, Genesis chapter 34, verse 1, tells us this. Now Dinah, the daughter Leah, had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. Now remember, friends, we're in the middle of the story of Jacob. And if you've been with us through the last few podcasts, you will remember that Jacob originally fled his homeland for deceiving his father and his brother. But now, 20 years later, he has come back. He's been reconciled with his brother, and he ends up in this city of Shechem. And the passage reminds us at this point that he has a daughter as well as his sons. He has a daughter called Dinah. You may also recall that the story has told us so far that he has had 12 sons, but this is referring to his one and only daughter, Dinah. Now, probably we shouldn't be surprised with her having 12 brothers. She probably wanted to have a social life among the women of the land. So verse 1 says she went out to find a woman friend, probably someone her own age that she could relate to. Only it was a local woman that she went out seeking. She went out and looked for companionship among the not the Israelite women. Now, this is probably because it tells us they're based in Shechem. So all she would find there if she went out into that area, of course, would be local Canaanite women. And of course, being based in Shechem, if she goes out amongst that community, all she'll come across really are local women. Now, Bible teachers have tried to figure out how old she was, and given that there's very little information, it's not an exact science. But one commentary I read said she was probably between 13 and 15 years old, and another said she was 15 or 16 years old. So if you do some research, the formed opinion seems to suggest she's probably somewhere between 13 and 16 years old. So she is what is today we would call a young teenager. And she's looking for some girlfriends, but when she goes out amongst the place in which she lives, things take a dark turn. Verse 2 tells us, when Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, the ruler of the area, saw her, he took her and he raped her. Oh dear. The one who has raped her, have you noticed, he's called Shechem, and the region's also called Shechem. That means that he's a prince, if you like, a sort of the son of a ruler of the region. So he's clearly someone who has and probably had a sense of entitlement about his special privilege that he had. Isn't this a familiar story of sexual violence, even when it happens today? It invariably involves an abuse of power. And there's little doubt that Shechem here, the person, grew up with a sense of entitlement and probably thought that he was above everybody else. And today, when we hear stories of sexual violence, we still hear about the power or the privilege of it and the abuse of it that often happens when these terrible things happen. People with power and privilege are in danger of and being inclined towards thinking they can do whatever they wish. They think they can just go out and do whatever they want, that the laws don't apply to them, and that is absolutely what's going on here. But let me just make another observation. Jacob should have provided some protection for the young girl, his daughter, living under his roof. After all, they were living in a pagan neighborhood. They were living in an area whose reputation for moral living had been identified in the Genesis story so far. So she's going out into a neighborhood that wasn't Israelite. They were pagans, surrounded by pagans, and their practices that they carried out. Well, we can guess. We don't need to guess. We can look at the text to see what the attitude and the actions of the pagan people around them were. So Bible experts tend to agree that Jacob here is being described and being identified as falling down as a father. He's not protecting his young teenage daughter, and unfortunately she's going to pay the consequences. What's interesting in this particular case is the man who rapes her then says he's attracted to her. Look at the next verse, verse 3. His heart was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her, and Shechem said to his father Hamor, get me this girl as my wife. So even though he's violated her, it says he's fallen in love with her and he wants to marry her. The story continues. When Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the field with their livestock, so he did nothing about it until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk with Jacob, and meanwhile Jacob's sons came in from the fields as soon as they heard what had happened. They were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not have been done. Now, it was absolutely the custom of the day to ask parents to make arrangements for children when their children were getting married. So it was according to the custom of the day for Shechem to go to his father and say, look, I found this girl I want to marry. Now, if his son was going to marry Dinah, then as a father, that meant he would have to go and speak to her father, Jacob. And these opening verses are just sort of setting the stage for what is about to happen when they meet. So what happens next is Hamor, Shechem's father, goes to Jacob and requests that they make arrangements for marriage. And this is where the story really starts to get quite interesting. We know Jacob has heard about these events, but the sons in the fields, they're out with the livestock. So Jacob keeps quiet about it until they come home. He hasn't gone out and drawn them in immediately. Now that's particularly interesting because when we get deeper into this book, he seems to be much more proactive when one of his sons go missing or something potentially bad happens to one of his sons. He seemed to get very upset, yet his daughters got raped here and he appears to be quite passive about the whole thing. Now, some have suggested that it would be the custom for him to wait until the sons got home before telling them, rather than calling them in from the fields, but that doesn't really cut it for me. If you read the rest of the passage, it's obvious that he is passive in this whole situation. In fact, you could say he's shockingly passive and insensitive to what's gone on, and he does nothing about it until the brothers actually come home. So what we see here is the father of Shechem has come out to speak with Jacob, and his sons are now coming in from the field, and at this point they hear about what's happened. So Dinah's brothers, we are told, are very angry. Now let's just pause for a moment and think about, do you see the contrast here? It hasn't mentioned Jacob getting angry at any point yet, but it's obvious that the brothers are getting very upset. They're furious, in fact, it tells us. And Jacob is just being passive in the whole situation, but these brothers are angry, saying Shechem has done a disgraceful thing by sleeping with their sister. Shechem has done an outrageous thing in Israel, is how they actually word it. Now, what's significance in their response, as detailed in that verse, is their use of the word Israel. This is the first time the word has appeared in this regard, and it's indicative of the fact that this word is used to make the point that this terrible thing has been done among God's chosen people, Israel. So the author here is saying the offense is pointing out that they recognize that the offense is against one of God's chosen people, and that's what they're angry about that. It was their father Jacob who had his name changed by God himself to Israel, and it is against this situation, this family line, that this has been done. It was his daughter and their sister that had been violated. So verse 8 to 10 then tell us, but Hamor said to them, my son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife. Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourself. You can settle amongst us. The land is open to you. Live in it and trade in it and acquire property in it. All right, here's the proposal. Here's the background to the marriage proposal made by Shechem's father. But note, it's not just for marriage. It's much wider than that. It is to share the land together and for both their sets of children and family lines to intermarry. But remember what God said about his chosen people, about this people that he named Israel when he chose them. Remember what he said when he made his first covenant with them? He said they were going to be a people set apart for him. They were clearly not meant to intermarry. So this is a bad suggestion. But on top of that, Shechem's saying not only should they intermarry, but they should make this a commercial venture. They should make a commercial thing out of this whole arrangement. He's saying, look, let's live in this land together, and let's not just intermarry. Let's trade together. Let's do business together. So he didn't just ask that Jacob's daughter becomes married to his son. He's making a much larger and wider proposition here, namely that we create this new mixed community and make it the basis of our new business relationships, and out of which we can create a whole new society. Can you see where it's going wrong here? Then Shechem said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes. I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for your bride and the gift I am to bring as great as you like, and I will pay whatever you ask. Only give me the young woman as my wife." Now, it still seems to me that there's a real sense of entitlement in this young lad, in the sense the way he said, "Only give me this young woman as my wife." Whatever you can say about Shechem, and there are a lot of negative things you can say about him, it does appear, though, that he genuinely wants to marry Dinah. And it does appear that he perhaps has maybe even fallen in love with her. So is this different times? Or maybe not so different? He's willing to pay whatever they ask for the dowry. "Just give me the girl. I want to marry her." That was his request. That was what he wanted. And here's the response. Because their sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. Now, the key word in this verse is deceitfully. It tips us off to pay attention to what's coming next. So we need to understand, we need to pay attention that what they're about to say is an attempt to deceive Shechem and Shechem's father. They aren't sincere. They aren't speaking the truth here. And this is the beginning of a great deception, pure and simple. The narrative picks up in verse 14, where it tells us, "They said to them, 'We can't do such a thing. We can't give you our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into agreement with you on one condition only, that you will become like us, circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We will settle among you and become one people with you.'" Now, remember, they don't mean any of this. How do we know that? Because the text in the preceding verses pointed out that this was all a deception. Now, if you recall, God told Abraham to practice circumcision from then on in, which was part of the symbol, a sign that God had given to set his people apart and to greatly multiply Abraham's family line and give him a lot of descendants, out of whom the Messiah would eventually come. The Messiah, not just for the Jewish nation, but for the whole world. But we need to understand that other people at that time also practiced circumcision, even adult circumcision on occasion, so that this request that all the men of the Shechem nation be circumcised, it's not completely out of the ordinary. The request would have struck them as a challenging but a reasonable thing. They think if we can just adopt this custom and all of us are circumcised, then we consolidate what they obviously think is a great deal. So keep that proposal in mind, but keep in mind that it was a deception. All right, let's just continue reading the story. Verse 17. "But if you will not agree to be circumcised, we'll take our sister and go." Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem. The young man, who was most honored of all his father's family, lost no time in doing what they said, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gate of the city to speak to the men of the city. So here we pause here, and it seems that these two groups of people they separate for a moment, and they're going to take it back, and they're going to discuss the plan with the wider group of people, with the leadership of the Shechemite people at the city gates. Continues in verse 21. These men are friendly towards us. They will let them live in our land and trade in it, and the land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters, and they can marry ours. But the men will agree to live with us as one people, only on the condition that our males be circumcised, as they themselves are. Won't their livestock, their property, and all their other animals become ours? So let us agree to the terms, and they will settle amongst us. So the Shechemite people are saying, you know what? Let's do this. They have this discussion, and it tells us all the men went out to the city gates and agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. It's important to note that in ancient times, all the main business dealings were done at the city gates. So this is saying something like uh, Hamor and Shechem gathered the people together at the city gates. It's a bit like saying they called a meeting at City Hall and the Shechemite Council ratified this plan. The plan is that they will become one people. We will swap our daughters and we will marry their sons and their daughters, and their daughters will marry our sons, and we're all going to live happily ever after. Is that even a possibility? Is that really how this is all going to work out? Well, we'll find out when we come back and look at the second part of Genesis chapter 34 next time. So hi there, we're back into the main text of Genesis 34, and we've been looking at the situation where, as a result of Dinah's rape, that's Jacob's only daughter, by the son of the leader of the Shechemites, they have now supposedly reached this agreement whether they will allow the families to intermingle, providing the Shechemites get circumcised. And the thinking is, well, if we do this and we deal with it in this way, then we can all live happily ever after. So is that a possibility, do you think? Is that really how things are going to work out? I don't think that's likely to happen, not for a second. So what are they up to? Well, if you remember, we found out last time that this whole plan was a deception on the part of Jacob's sons, particularly Simeon and Levi. I hate to be so blunt, but can you imagine the effect on all the men in a town of them all being circumcised at the same time? I'll say it as plainly as I can. They certainly wouldn't be in any shape to be a fighting force. Imagine it would be a bit like circumcising a rugby team or a football team and then expecting them to play a match the next day. So let's just pick up the text where we left off last time in 34, beginning again at verse 25. It says, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. Now, I would point out that that would be their families, their individual tribes, and the men along with them, not just the 2 individuals. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the sisters where the city had been defiled. So the rest of the brothers follow up and do the looting. So the men of Shechem, they're still in pain. They're disabled, to put it mildly. Can you imagine post-surgery, 24 hours later in those days? I'm sure even a significant number of them might have been carrying infections or bad reactions to the surgery. And these 2 sons of Jacob lead the attack on the city, and they kill all the men. It then tells us that we find out that the other brothers then follow up, and they seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the house. Now, I believe the text says that only 2 of the sons committed the massacre, but the rest of the sons certainly join in on the plunder later. And all that was left in the city after the Levi and Simeon had been there were the surviving wives and children, and they're taken captive, and they actually plunder the whole city. They've killed all the men, and now the brothers take the women and the children, probably making them slaves or at best servants. The point is here, they've taken everything. They've taken the animals, they've taken all the material things out of the house. They've picked this place clean. This was an absolute right. Let's just close off the final verses of this chapter. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed. But they replied, that's the sons, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? Now, one of the things we see here is we get a real insight into Jacob. However, before going any further, I think I need to remind you of how troubling it can be to approach on a chapter like this and approach it just in isolation. This is one of the dangers of when people approach a Bible verse, section, or chapter and study it in isolation. It's very important that when you do it, you place it in the context. If you study and look at what's going on here without remembering and putting these events depicted within this story, within the context of the entire book of Genesis, you are potentially going to run into trouble. It's always tempting to approach an individual text or an individual chapter in the Bible and try and pull something positive out of it. But that's not always possible, because sometimes a story or even an entire chapter in this part is entirely negative, and it's entirely negative. It's a negative part of a narrative contained within a larger story. So we've got to take it at face value, and that's what's going on here. These events are negative and they're just recorded for us. It does not mean in any way that God approves of what has gone on here. If we approach this chapter in isolation and fail to place it within the context and meaning of the entire book of Genesis, then we are in great danger of reaching the wrong conclusions. So let's approach it cautiously and deal face on with the problems this horrible story highlights regarding both the character flaws of Jacob and the sinful acts of his sons. He finds out what his sons have done, yes, and he's troubled, but do you notice he's troubled because the effect on his reputation and the possible future hostility from the other Canaanite tribes living in the region. His daughter got raped, and that didn't seem to bother him that much, did it? Yet he finds out his sons have done this massacre, and he's greatly distressed, but not necessarily at the massacre itself, but at the possible consequences that might flow out of it. He did not get upset, perhaps which he should have, because of their abuse of the circumcision ritual. This was a sacred rite, and they had used it and abused it to try and gain advantage over their enemies. Allowing these unrepentant pagans to get circumcised is a clear case of abusing the God-given right, and in a sense they are breaking the covenant that God had made with them. So this was a great disobedience to God, all of this. What bothers Jacob is, when you look at it, what bothers him, you'll see he constantly in this closing verses refers to himself and how these events affect him. It appears to me he's mainly concerned about himself, less concerned about his sons. At least they did feel that action was needed, and that they, as they said, they felt their daughter had been treated as a prostitute, and they felt that there should have been a response. Siva, Simeon and Levi, they were concerned about this sister. They're the ones who say, aren't you concerned about our daughter, your daughter, our sister? And the answer is, if we're truthful, not really, or certainly not nearly enough. All right, we've reached the end of the actual narrative of the story, and we've unpicked the story verse by verse. So the question we have to ask is, what does it teach us today? How do we apply what's referenced here for us when we get up on a Monday morning? The point of this story is that when the sisters were violated, her brothers deceived the family involved and killed all the men in the city and plundered the property of that city. So what's the point in that? Is there anything we can learn from this? It seems entirely pessimistic. Well, to really understand that, as I've said, you've got to understand some of the things that are going on in the book of Genesis. So let me make a couple of observations. I think when people approach the Bible today, they often want to hear something about themselves and to draw something out of it that they can practically apply. Well, that's illegitimate, except sometimes when we meet the Bible at own terms, its purpose is to teach us about God and not necessarily about us. Eventually it'll get round to something that we can pull out of it that will help meet our needs, but primarily some narratives are there to teach us about the Lord, or to stand in contrast to the Lord and his way of approaching things. And I suspect that that is the case here. So with that in mind, let me make some observation. So what's the point of the story? What is the point of this sad, sordid story? Well, firstly, at no point does it show approval of what the sons of Jacob did here. Just think for a moment about the contrast between this story and the other stories we've heard in the book of Genesis so far. For example, Abraham was seen to deal honorably with the Hittites when he sojourned in their land. Isaac behaved peacefully with the Philistines when he passed through their strange land. But now Jacob and his sons have become aggressors in a conflict with the local Shechemites. Simeon and Levi's unrepentant treachery stands in stark contrast to Esau and Jacob's recent moral developments, and also the more balanced way in which previous issues with local people have been dealt with by the forefathers. In contrast to previous incidents throughout Genesis, this chapter, notice, it contains no prayer, it contains no going before God to seek his will in the situation, no divine revelation is seen, no promise of blessing, and in fact, no explicit mention of God at all in this chapter. Most Bible experts believe that the thing that should jump off this page when you look at it is a stark contrast of how different it is in tone to all the other chapters, both before it and after it. When faced with potential conflict with other families, tribes, and nations, even prior to this, the people of God have been seen to deal honestly and honorably with other people. And you come to this story, and it's the exact opposite. The story is obviously not recorded in a way that suggests the Lord approves of any of what has gone on here. So that's an important observation, and take that and hold it. The second observation I would like to make is that when studied within the context of the whole book of Genesis, this episode explains why later Jacob will pass over Simeon and Levi when he gives a special blessing to his family. That's something that happens in the future. When you come to the story, having read everything else before it, you'll see the stark contrast to the other stories. But as we go deeper into the book, it is going to become more obvious that this story has had a profound effect, particularly on the two men who instigated the attack and initiated the plunder. It's not overly evident here just yet, but trust me, there is a deeply significant moment for these individuals coming in the book of Genesis. I haven't got time to go into it in great detail now, but we'll get there when we move into a few chapters later in this book. But let me just say that this story and its repercussions have an enormous impact as we can continue the study and the narrative through the whole book. This is a very significant event in setting the scene for what will come later. So again, it's all about holding the story within the context of the wider book. I've been saying that a lot recently, I feel, as we've been working through Genesis, because it's one of the keys to interpreting this book and indeed interpreting the entire Bible, I believe. Context, context, context. It's vitally important. And it remains important throughout the whole Bible, not just as we approach the single book of Genesis. In fact, it becomes absolutely vital when we later reach books like the books of Judges, which we'll be coming to later. If you don't hold these stories within the context of the narrative or the main message of the Bible, you'll never be able to draw out the points that are being made. So let me just summarize and say this much. The story here, the main headline is, as a result of sin, Jacob passed over some of his brothers when it comes to giving out the blessing. That's the bottom line of what this will mean in the greatness and fullness of time. The blessing will be given to Judah instead of these two brothers. So these events have a profound ramification for them, but also we shall discover, and it will unravel further, for the whole nation of Israel. Another observation, a third observation, this story shows the importance of keeping the Israelites, the chosen people, separate from other people, and on this occasion it was the Canaanites. I pointed out as I was going through the story that God did not want the Israelites to intermarry with the Canaanites, and that is what is being proposed in this chapter, and that is what was not supposed to ever happen. It was okay for people to embrace the faith of the nation of Israel and be circumcised and drawn in, but that's not what was going on here. Had they intermarried and done this in the way it's described and plotted by these brothers, Israel would have been swallowed up by the Canaanites. It was necessary for the nation of Israel to remain pure, and they were not going to be allowed to marry with people from other nations and other countries. And the use of the name of the nation as Israel, used here for the first time of the nation, indicates that the writer of this account, who is Moses, of course, had a significant understanding and recognition of the deeper values and the implications of the event that he was recording here. Later in the Mosaic law, it will be made clear that Israel was not ever allowed to play the harlot with the Canaanites, as it's described in other books. They must never defile themselves with pagans by intermarriage or by making covenant treaties with such people. In fact, one of the things that's going on here is if they didn't marry the locals, then that would mean that the contamination of the children of Israel would not happen. They had to remain pure, because remember, it is through this nation that the Messiah is going to come. That's a big point. But the other big point, some would say the biggest point here, is that although the narrative is difficult, dark, and the circumstances are challenging, negative, destruction, it still demonstrates the sovereignty of God in all situations. God sometimes, because of human sin, has to use the most unimaginable things to accomplish his purposes. So he does not approve of all of this, and yet there is a sense in which the sovereignty of God is still used, that these circumstances are still used to fulfill his purposes. Someone writing on this once said, whilst the story in this chapter operates on a level of family honor and the brothers' concern for their ravaged sister, the story nonetheless also carries along the theme that runs so clearly through Jacob's narrative. Namely, that God works through and often in spite of limited self-serving plans of human beings. The writer's purpose is not to improve these human plans and schemes, but to show how God and his sovereign grace will achieve his purpose through them. It's an old quotation, but I thought it was particularly insightful, a really helpful observation that God will never be limited by our self-serving, even our pernicious and ill-motivated plans. He works in spite of them. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, even his wrath can praise him. God uses everything. He will use it all. So he is even able to use this sin, this clear sin, this sinful situation, to accomplish his greater purpose, to work it for good. Individually, very importantly, individually, the sinners will still pay dearly for their failures, but in terms of the nation and in terms of the ultimate plan of God, his will be accomplished, his purposes will be fulfilled. One final observation. Another message I believe embedded in this passage concerns what should be the right response for people when they're confronted by evil. In other words, how to live in a wicked world. That's the story here, and that's what it's all about. Here the wickedness was upon the Israelites who are living among the Canaanites, who are described elsewhere as an incredibly wicked people. And what we have here is an example of how Jacob responds, and how they respond to that wickedness. And it seems to me that one of the practical lessons we can take from the story is we can notice that both protagonists, Jacob and his sons, their response is one of two extremes. Jacob was indifferent and indecisive. He was passive. He didn't do anything. On the other hand, his sons sought justice, but they were ruthless and they were excessive. So here are the two extremes when responding to evil that is visited upon us. One is just to remain passive, indifferent, insensitive, and do nothing. That is wrong, friends. But the other extreme is equally wrong. The sons here, the two especially, go to all kinds of excesses to right the wrong. The right response, it seems to me, must lie somewhere between these two extremes. For example, we should seek justice when appropriate, of course, but at the same time, we should not be excessive in executing that justice. There are two things going on here at the same time, and I think we need to unscramble them. At no point in their excessive use of justice was there any opportunity for restoration to happen. We do need to recognize that Jacob, fundamentally, at the end of the day, should have protected his daughter. He knew he was living amongst an evil people, and but yet when things went wrong, he was too passive. And the point I want to make for us today is we must also go to neither of these two extremes. Don't be passive, but don't be too over-aggressive. Rather try and find and do what is honourable, honest, and deal with the situation like God would do, trying to find that middle ground where we can express truth and justice, but allow the opportunity for mercy and forgiveness. So let me conclude by quoting what I think was said well. I found this on the internet. Attempting to destroy or punish evil through lawlessness or unrighteous acts should not be confused with righteous indignation. Rather, the righteous must seek justice and oppose evil in a manner that brings honour to the Lord and his covenant. So the right response to evil, friends, is to try and figure out a response that honours the Lord and does what is right and seeks justice, but all at the same time. In other words, try and deal with the situation the same way as the Lord would do.